Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Archives of Heroes and Patriots can be found on both Facebook and YouTube. Just search Heroes and Patriots, KMEC Radio, Mendocino Environmental Center. Thanks go out today to ELLIOTT, HERSKOWITZ-HALE, and Kevin KAFAYI, who have helped in preparing today's show. Today is Monday, April 16th, 2018. We are streaming live from the Mendocino Environmental Center in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey. John Goodiron is away today, but plans to be back with us in the next time. April 2018 has proven to be one of indictments, investigations, pardons, FBI raids, and the bombing again of Syria, plus a book launch. That's all happening in the first 2 weeks or so of April. Today, we welcome back to our program Melvin A. Goodman, who appeared on the show several months ago as he talked about his new book, Whistleblower at the CIA. Mr. Goodman is an expert in intelligence, and he had a specialty in U.S.-Soviet relations. He is a former CIA analyst. As I mentioned, we did talk in length about his new book, Whistleblower at the CIA. So we turn to him to talk about all things intelligence, foreign policy, and security. Our program today with Mr. Goodman should be looking at, as time permits, the bombing last week in Syria, Trump's pardoning of Dick Cheney's former chief of staff, I. Louis Scooter Libby, of obstruction and perjury, President Trump's nominee of GINA HASPEL as the next CIA director, and the appointment of former CIA Director Mike Pompeo as our next Secretary of State. All this and more as we welcome back Mel Goodman. Mel, are you with us?
Yes, Mary. Good to be with you, but that's a lot of bad news to be spending the next hour on.
Isn't it the truth? I wanted to speak first of the more recent things, namely what happened Friday night, and then also what happened almost in tandem with the pardoning of Scooter Libby. Last Friday night, U.S., British, and French forces struck 3 sites in Syria, largely the chemical weapons infrastructure, if you will, in retaliation for Assad's chemical attack on his own people. Trump, hinting only the week before, said he wanted the United States to pull out 2,000 U.S. soldiers in eastern Syria. Then he tweeted that the bombs were coming, and then they might or might not be coming. And finally, he announced the airstrike, I guess, late Friday evening. Let's start with the 2 events. A year ago, Trump bombed Syria, literally in April of 2007, and then again now here in 2018. The target last time was the Damascus airport, which by all accounts was rebuilt in hours, if not days. And the Pentagon has said, yes, mission accomplished with respect to wiping out the infrastructure of those 3 targets. However, the New York Times is saying that the Syrian strike attracts talks but not changes. Can you give us some thoughts and opinions on what has happened in that region?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge with regard to the Syrian strike this year is that Donald Trump was way out in front of his national security community when he warned not only Syria, but Iran and Russia that we have missiles that are nice, new, and smart, meaning smart weapons, and created the impression that this was going to be a large-scale attack and not a one-time effort to attack targets in Syria. I think at that point he shocked his own national security community, and that's why you had such a delay from the time he announced the attack and said it would be within 24 or 48 hours, and then it was by the end of the week that we finally saw this attack, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, on Friday. And I think what happened is Secretary of Defense James Mattis, former 4-star Marine general, got a hold of the decision-making and made sure that the plan was precise and proportionate. And I think one of the first things that I could hear was that sigh of relief coming from the Kremlin
right.
In Moscow, that it wasn't a large-scale, continuous bombing attack, but a one-time attack. To talk about mission accomplished, as Donald Trump, if he had any sense, well, we know he has no sense of history, but if
Correct.
he has any sense of current events and what happened after the attack in Iraq, where George W. Bush misused the term mission accomplished, he never would have used those words.
Right.
Not only was the mission not accomplished, it's not even clear what the mission was.
Right. The Pentagon had that.
Facilities. There was no indication that there were any casualties at these facilities,
right.
which indicates that maybe the facilities weren't even occupied. And two, there was no plume, no venting of a chemical arsenal, of a chemical stockpile. So it raises serious questions about were there individuals at these sites and were there chemicals at these sites. And my guess is that these were abandoned facilities. And remember, we're talking about two types of chemical weapons. We know that chlorine was used.
Right.
Well, you don't need large sites to produce chlorine. Chlorine is very active on a global basis, but particularly in the Middle East, for water purification. And even when you think about the Obama plan in 2013, 2014, in cooperation with the Russians to try to remove chemical weapons from Syria, there was never even mention of chlorine. Chlorine was banned going back to the League of Nations convention after World War I, but there was no later reference toward chlorine. Now, there's still, even though it hasn't been proven, the possibility that sarin gas was also used, nerve gas was also used. But we don't know that. And today, when the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons tried to get to the site to hold an inspection, it's kind of interesting that the Syrians and the Russians would not permit this delegation to enter the town where the chemical weapons were used. Mm-hmm. I know there are a lot of people out there who don't believe that the Syrians were responsible for this attack. I frankly think that's nonsense.
Why do you think it's nonsense?
Because when you look at the fact that these barrel bombs and cluster bombs were dropped, that there were helicopters in the air, there's only one force over there that has this kind of weaponry to bring chemical weapons to bear on a target, and that's the Syrian Air Force. I don't think the Russians were involved. I think the Russians would not have approved of this, but I don't think Assad sought their approval, because I think the Russians were satisfied with having willful ignorance of the fact that chemical weapons were used. Let's face it, if you watch Putin, his body language and what he has said on occasion, Assad is an embarrassment to Putin. It's clear that Putin has an interest, the Russians have an interest in maintaining their air base and their naval base in Syria, and they don't want to see the United States try to pull off another exercise in regime change. But there was no need to be using chemical weapons at this point. This was an outrageous, unconscionable act, and frankly, I support the military action that was taken. If I had my druthers, it would have been slightly more extensive. It would have been more than just chemical sites. I would have hit a couple of Syrian military sites as well to make it clear to Assad that there is tremendous risk in using these kinds of weapons against civilians who are in no position to protect themselves. But the idea that there was a mission, that mission was accomplished, that there's a Trump doctrine, or that there's a strategy or the plan, the thing you have to keep in mind in all of this is we have a president who has a very limited decision-making capability. I don't know what all of his extensive psychological problems are, but it's clear, and I'm not trained in this field, but it's clear he has a problem in impulse control, and I think he has some cognitive decline. I've gone back using YouTube and various things that are available on the Internet to listen to his statements in the 1980s and the 1990s and compare it to the Trump who speaks today. There's no question that he can't even speak in full sentences anymore. His repetition of words and the use of the same words over and over again. This is what I find so frightening.
Well, you know, Jim Coney came on and said he didn't think that Trump was mentally impaired. He thought he was morally impaired.
Well, I think maybe it's both.
Really?
Maybe it's a combination. The moral problems we know about, the way he's lived his entire life. The mental impairment, of course, is controversial, But it's kind of interesting that there are so many psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, and I've had some of them in my classroom at Johns Hopkins University, who believe in the duty to inform rather than the so-called Goldwater rule that doesn't allow psychiatrists to discuss someone who they haven't examined. But the psychiatrists and the community that I've talked to have no doubt that there's some cognitive impairment with this man. Now, the idea that someone who's got cognitive limitations, and I think there's no doubt about that, is sitting in the White House with the kind of control he has over the United States military, and the fact that the Congress has really never asserted itself in any of these areas involving the use of military force. In fact, when you talk about willful ignorance, I can't think of a better example of willful ignorance than the Senate, the United States Senate. There are some senators who are now striking back at the administration and want to put limits on his decision-making capability, limits on our support for Saudi Arabia, which is guilty of war crimes in Yemen, some effort to change the nuclear decision-making control and command, but these aren't going to get any majority votes. So we have a president who is capable of making decisions that involved the future of all of us, putting all of us at risk and a certain amount of the global community at risk, and very little limitation.
Can you
That's why I give so much credit to Secretary of Defense Mattis for making sure that people in his in the Trump war cabinet, like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and others, didn't control the decision-making in this particular operation. Mattis deserves, I think, tremendous credit from the national security community, and I've been one who's been critical of all these generals in the cabinet, but this is one time where Mattis proved his worth.
Could you walk us through the process of something like this prior to a bombing, which my understanding is a declaration of war? We have no U.S. ambassadors essentially in the Middle East, and right now we're sitting with no Secretary of State. What is the process for, let's say, we learn about the chemical attack, which is not the first, and he's killed 500,000 people with conventional weapons. So we don't have folks in the region that might give us intelligence. How is intelligence gathered, examined, and then decisions made through this process? What should normally happen?
Well, if we had a normal national security system, and I think Barack Obama's system was the standard application of national security decision-making. We know that George W. Bush didn't exercise the normal command procedures because he was responsible for creating false intelligence. The CIA was responsible for producing false intelligence, and we were given a series of lies about weapons of mass destruction.
Correct.
Which was comparable to what happened in Vietnam when we had a phony Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But in a normal system, you would have intelligence coming into the intelligence community, particularly to the Central Intelligence Agency, but also the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department. And if the intelligence, in this case, talked about chemical weapons being used against harmless civilians, the National Security Council would be informed, the President would be informed, but you would have National Security Council meetings. You would have either deputies meetings, where the deputies to all the major national security agencies would be represented, or you would have a principals meeting, and you would have a full-scale discussion. But as you said in the lead-in to this show, we don't have a Secretary of State now. Rex Tillerson was fired. Rex Tillerson was obviously incompetent and hollowed out the State Department. That's why you don't have these key positions you don't have them in Latin America. You don't have them in Europe. You don't have an ambassador in South Korea. You don't have an ambassador in Germany. You don't have special envoys that Barack Obama created for situations like Tibet or South Sudan.
And isn't it on
hollowed out national security decision making?
Isn't it on Trump to appoint and get those folks in place? Certainly within the first. Go ahead.
Trump is responsible for, but really, if you had good cabinet secretaries, which Trump does not have, it's the cabinet secretaries who are responsible for staffing out their leading positions. Tillerson had 24 major positions to fill. He filled about 2, 3, or 4 of them. Now, one thing Mike Pompeo will do if he's confirmed, and I think he will be confirmed. And I'm not a fan of Mike Pompeo. I didn't think he should have been CIA director. I think he's even worse as a State Department Secretary of State. But he is probably an effective bureaucrat, and he will fill out this hollowed-out State Department. I don't know if we're going to be pleased by all the people he's going to name, but I thought it was very interesting. Before his confirmation hearing started last week, he called Hillary Clinton for advice. He called John Kerry for advice. I thought this was reaching out in a bipartisan way, and he sort of indicated to those officials who had resigned from the State Department, who were fed up with Rex Tillerson, that maybe it's time to consider returning. So I don't think he's going to completely staff the operation with neoconservatives that reflect his point of view when he was in the House of Representatives. I'm a cautious optimist on that regard, because I think he wants to be an effective steward, an effective manager of the department.
So let's say we get intelligence, good, bad, or just absolutely wrong, and it goes to the key principles, which we may or may not have in place right now. Did that, you're saying that process did not happen, let's say. Congress was also
not deliberative process. Donald Trump got out in front of the entire national security community, and before there were any meetings that took place, before there was any confirmation of who actually used chemical weapons and were there chemical weapons used, he made this remark threatening the interests of Russia and Iran, not just Syria, and talked about weapons being nice, new, and smart, and that they would be headed in the direction of Syria. So he made it clear that not only was a red line drawn, but next to a drop-dead decision to actually use the weapons, he set up the process to make sure we couldn't back away from the use of weapons. What Mattis did was to slow down the process on two levels. One, to make sure we didn't do anything that was disproportionate, and two, to make sure we had some allied support. And here I think it was important to go to both May in Britain and Macron in France and get them to sign on. And I think they were involved in probably a handful of flights. I can't imagine. We haven't really been told the breakdown. We know that twice as many weapons were used this year as were used last year. I think it was 59 missiles were launched in 2017, about 104 in 2018. So you had some British and French participation, but my guess is it was extremely limited. But the British are there. They're on the island of Cyprus, which is very close to Syrian territory. And the French have aircraft in Jordan. And, of course, we have huge forces in the Middle East, particularly in the Persian Gulf, but also in the Mediterranean. We had cruise missile destroyers. We had B-1 bombers. So we did annihilate and destroy these three positions, but we haven't, at least I haven't seen any confirmation that these were really important facilities for the chemical industry. So when the Defense Department said we took the heart out of their chemical weapons capability, well, that's nonsense.
The fact is they probably don't even know.
Those facilities had nothing to do with chlorine gas whatsoever, and that can be produced in a garage anywhere in Syria. Sarin might require somewhat more sophistication, but there's no indication, judging from the fact that there was no plume from or any venting of these chemical weapons. And I remember when I was at the CIA in the 1980s and early 90s, when U.S. aircraft did hit Iraqi chemical weapons facility, and there were not only plumes venting of these chemical weapons, but in 1991, Desert Storm, a lot of Americans were gassed in the Gulf, and they were gassed by weapons that were released because we had bombed facilities where chemical weapons were stored. So if you hit an actual storage area of chemical weapons, you can do tremendous damage to your own forces as well as to the adversary you're targeting. You
said you felt that this was a needed action by U.S. and our allies. It's, by all accounts, it was chlorine. Why do you feel that way? And what about Trump's announcing that he was going to pull out our 2,000 or so troops out of Syria just the week prior?
Well, again, it's hard to put any stock or interpretation to anything that Trump says. I strongly believe what I said about his cognitive capabilities. I I don't take anything that he says literally. It's hard to take what he says seriously. So once he makes these statements and gets out in front of the national security community, all you can do is count on national security officials to talk him back. Mattis did it this time, and there's no guarantee he will be able to do it.
So since
next time, but for the civilized world to stand by and watch as Assad targets innocent civilians, men, women, and children, which is something his father did. Remember, the Assad family has been in charge of Syria since the early 1970s.
Right.
They've annihilated civilians. The father did this in Hama, and now the son is doing it in several locations. There have been at least 50 uses of chemical weapons in the past year, according to various human rights organizations. So again, I know there's this great skepticism, and there are a lot of people, particularly on the left, who don't believe anything that comes out of the U.S. intelligence community, but I would warn against that kind of cynicism. I think that kind of cynicism is very dangerous. And if the civilized world is going to say never again in the wake of the Holocaust and have that mean anything, then how can you allow the unconscionable use of chemical weapons against innocent people just to drive rebels out of a particular urban area or civilian area? And this is exactly what Assad was doing.
Wow. So we've had this second bombing. What's going to happen, do you think? What would be the best scenario to happen after this? I mean, this was a one-off bombing, the Pentagon has said. And I know Nikki Haley has come out and said, well, if they do it again, there'll be hell to pay, so to speak. What's your feeling?
She said something really obnoxious at the UN, and I find her utterances rather obnoxious overall. She said the United States is locked and loaded.
Yeah.
This is the kind of bellicose, arrogant, obnoxious talk that American representatives, particularly our representative at the United Nations, which is there to prevent this kind of activity, should not be uttering. But again, she's part, when I use the term war cabinet, I think of someone like GINA HASPEL at CIA, who was known as Bloody GINA to a lot of her colleagues at CIA. Or I think of a Mike Pompeo and some of the remarks he's made, who would like to see the reinstitution of torture abuse. Or Nikki Haley. Frankly, H.R. McMaster, I didn't think was one of the moderate adults in the room either, but now we've gotten someone really worse in John Bolton, who shouldn't be in anyone's cabinet at any position, let alone someone as the National Security Advisor, who will end up spending more time with the president than any other member of the national security community. So these are very dangerous times, and right now, the only thing standing between Trump and the misuse of military weapons and our military arsenal, which is incredibly lethal, is, again, a four-star Marine general. And I don't think this is what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wanted to put limits on the national security decision-making of one individual.
Before we leave a discussion about Syria and Russia, your expertise, as I mentioned at the beginning, is on Soviet-U.S. relations. Could you just briefly, in your opinion, and what you've observed since the last, 14, 15 months that Trump has been in office, where are things?
Well, really, if you give me a couple minutes, we really have to back up.
Okay.
You have to go back to 1991 when there was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The United States was given an incredible strategic opportunity to create a new relationship with Russia that was different from anything during the Cold War.
Right.
And instead of doing that, which is something that George Kennan called for in the containment doctrine, the last part of the containment doctrine was that once the Soviet Union did reform itself, and he predicted it would happen, he thought it would happen sooner than it did, he did say, and the word he used was anchor, that it was important to anchor the Soviet Union or Russia to the Western security architecture. We did just the opposite. We didn't anchor them. Instead, we took the NATO Cold War alliance system and drew it closer to Russian borders, and Bill Clinton was responsible for that. George W. Bush was responsible for expanding NATO not only to East European states, but to the Baltic states that were former republics of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And just in the past year, even though the press hasn't paid much attention to it, NATO has expanded into Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, and Slovenia. This makes no sense whatsoever. This is what Putin is so exercised about, and he has a right to be. And in addition to that, George W. Bush abrogated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was the cornerstone of deterrence. And I think in some ways that was the first act that was the restart of a possible new Cold War. I noticed Putin said that in a recent interview he had with NBC News a couple weeks ago. So you have to take that into account, plus the deployment of a regional missile defense system in Poland and Romania. That only makes sense if you're trying to put limits on Russian capabilities. And if we're doing that against Russia, it's a violation of the INF agreement from the 1980s. So to look at Putin as the demon in all of this and to demonize Putin is to miss the false steps that we have made. The fact of the matter is, I think Moscow and Washington, which are in agreement on a lot of issues regarding Iran and nuclear weapons, North Korea and nuclear weapons, on non-proliferation, on international terrorism. There could be some cooperation, I think, even in Afghanistan. And possibly there could be cooperation on Syria. But to do that, you really have to blow a whistle, call timeout, stop all of these tit-for-tat moves that involve sanctions policy, that involves kicking out Russian diplomats, and then you have reciprocal moves by Russia. And I know there's a problem that's hanging over all of this involving Russian hacking into the Democratic and Republican national committees and their involvement in the election, and that's going to have to be discussed privately, and there are going to have to be rules of the road about what kind of cyber weapons you can use against the other side. But I think at some point, Moscow and Washington have to institutionalize a dialogue. Now, the irony of all of this is what Trump said he wanted to do during the campaign, yet he surrounded himself with people who were very anti-Russian and very anti-arms control. That's where these generals come into play. Mattis would never be a friend of Russia or arms control, nor would McMaster. Certainly Bolton isn't. Pompeo isn't. So it's not clear what Trump's motivations are in trying to improve relations with Russia, and that's why you get this engagement of the debate, as James Comey has now lent himself to, about has Trump been compromised? Are the Russians holding some material that they can use to politically bribe Donald Trump over one issue or another? The former CIA director, John Brennan, has hinted at this. Comey hinted at it last night in an interview with ABC News. We don't know what evidence Mueller is holding, but Mueller knows a hell of a lot more than anyone else does, and much more than we've learned so far from the Russian roulette book or the collusion book or the various coverages by the New York Times and the Washington Post that are doing excellent work at this particular time. There's a much larger story out there based on sensitive materials that has not leaked, and we should understand that. But at some point, it's important for Moscow and Washington to get back to some kind of institutionalized dialogue, but we don't have people in place. It must be. I know it's frustrating to European diplomats because I've talked to people with access to the embassies in Washington. They have no one to call. There's no one in position to talk to. There's no one with any authority at the State Department or the National Security Council. So this needs to be corrected. And again, you have a president with a very weak decision-making approach, and I think a weak decision-making capability, because I do think his cognitive capabilities have been compromised. It's hard to say when we're going to get this.
Right. If you just joined us, it's about 30 minutes past the hour. I am Mary Massey, and you're listening to Heroes and Patriots out of KMEC Radio. My guest today is Melvin A. Goodman. He is a national security and intelligence expert. He has worked as an analyst for the CIA and the State Department and has taught at the National War College and Johns Hopkins University. He is currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. I'd like to shift gears now and look at another interesting development that occurred last week. And in a way, it does relate to good, bad, and untrue intelligence, and that is the pardoning of Vice President Cheney's former chief of staff, Scooter Libby. He was found to be guilty of obstruction and perjury back when Bush 43 was in office. Dick Cheney badgered Bush to not only commute his sentence of 30 months and the $250,000 fine, he wanted him pardoned. What was going on then? Can you fill in a little bit for our listeners as to what was happening and who was really at fault?
Sure. This was a very sad period in American national security because it involved the outing of a clandestine officer at the Central Intelligence Agency by the name of Valerie Plame.
Mm-hmm.
Valerie Plame's husband, Ambassador Joe Wilson, was sent by the CIA to go over to West Africa to check on these accusations that the Bush administration was making that the country of Niger was supplying nuclear components, nuclear fuel to Iraq in order to create weapons of mass destruction. Wilson, who's been a very good diplomat, had a very outstanding career at the Department of State, also had some understanding of the nuclear industry. He had entered into it when he entered the private industry when he left the State Department, and he was a likely person to go on this mission. And when he got to Niger and talked to people from the government, from French industrialists who worked in the nuclear industry in Niger, he came back and made it clear that this was nonsense, that Niger had no connections to Saddam Hussein, and all of these accusations of supplies going back and forth between Niger and Iraq were phony. Now, this undercut the White House's rationale for going to war against Iraq, because remember, in September of 2002, this was when the decision was made, I think, maybe not a final drop-dead decision, but I think it was too late to talk Bush back from war. So there was a Sunday, I think it was the first Sunday in September, all of the members of Bush's war cabinet went on the various talk shows, Condi Rice, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and they all used the same language, that the smoking gun from Iraq shouldn't be the nuclear cloud. And then they jumped on the reports of Niger and Iraq and nuclear technology going back and forth. And the CIA falsely lended its support to these accusations. So when Wilson came back and then published his op-ed in the New York Times, Cheney particularly was furious. And I think, and even though we will never be able to substantiate this because the guilty party in this case, Libby, did not implicate his boss, Dick Cheney, but it's pretty clear that Dick Cheney ordered or permitted Scooter Libby to go to the press and make it clear that Valerie Plame was the CIA operative who selected her husband to go on this mission, and that they were part of an effort to derail the Bush administration from decision-making that they wanted to make with regard to Iraq. Now, in the 1980s, a federal law was passed. I was at the CIA then, and in 1979, the CIA station chief, a man by the name of Richard Welsh, was killed, was assassinated in Athens, Greece, where he was the station chief. And in the wake of that, a law was passed making it a federal crime to out or to identify a CIA operative who was operating undercover. This was a serious federal crime that had been committed. Mm-hmm. And Bush, who by this time was losing patience with Dick Cheney, ignored Cheney's efforts to pardon Libby. But he, as you say, he did commute the sentence. I don't think Libby ever served any jail time.
No.
And frankly, recently he's got back his ability to practice law.
Right. He paid the fine. Yeah.
And he got back his ability to vote in federal elections. So the pardon really doesn't add anything new to what we know about Libby's personal situation. But what Trump has really done, and people are using the word dog whistle. Well, this is more than a dog whistle. This is a full symphonic orchestration to all those people who have material that can be used against Donald Trump in any court setting. What he is saying, look, I pardon Louis Scooter Libby. you can expect the same treatment from me. Just keep your mouth shut. I think that's what this is all about, pure and simple. And to me, I would see this as another instrument or another factor to cite in any obstruction of justice charge. I mean, you have the firing of Comey, you have the pressure put on the Attorney General, you have the attack now on the Assistant Attorney General,
Rod
Rosenstein.
Rosenstein, right.
Rosenstein.
Mm-hmm.
You have the signal about pardons. You have his interest in getting rid of Mueller, which we know he tried to do last summer, but his lawyer, Don McGahn, threatened to leave the White House if he followed up on that, and we know in December he raised it again. So I think the Libby thing, which I guess could never be established as obstruction of justice, clearly is one more element, though, in his mindset of this is what he wants to do, and probably this is what he needs to do to save his administration.
Well, let's look at the fallout from this pardon. CIA operatives undercover, those that are current and perhaps might be thinking about a profession. What does this do for those folks who are in the field or going to be in the field? What message does this send to those folks?
Well, it's a message that is extremely harmful. But the thing about the CIA, and I spent 24 years there, the CIA people are very dedicated to what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And even with all of this bizarre activity going on, and all of this politicization of intelligence and politicization of the intelligence community, I still think they're probably going to keep their heads down and do their job. And they're not going to let the Libby pardon get in the way of what they have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And this is true, frankly, for the national security community. It's true for our military services. It's true for the intelligence community. It's true for the National Security Council. They have serious work to do, and their task now is to try to ignore the politicization of their work. I mean, when I was at the CIA in the 70s, there was a lot of, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of unhappiness with the election of Richard Nixon. I mean, at CIA, we had very good intelligence that we had to bring to bear that made it clear what we were doing in Vietnam was not going to be successful. And we were accused of spinning the intelligence by the White House. There were all sorts of attacks against the CIA that were similar to what Trump has been doing against the CIA. But we had to ignore all of that. Even when the CIA director was essentially fired by Richard Nixon. When he sent Richard Helms out from the CIA to be the ambassador to Iran, he was getting rid of someone who was bringing him bad news about Vietnam, and he was fed up with it. And that's why he brought James Schlesinger in to try to politicize the intelligence. And there was pushback against Schlesinger, and finally he was sent away from the CIA and sent over to the Defense Department, where it became easier to assert his will. So I think the civil servants and the intelligence officials who work at the CIA will ignore this awful activity that's taking place that frankly gets worse every day. I think what Comey has done is to go much too far as a former FBI director to make these personal attacks on the president of the United States.
Is that because the investigation is still underway, or why do you feel that way?
Because I think these ad hominem attacks about Trump's personality, about Trump's looks, raising this idea that the Trump organization is comparable to a mob family, this isn't helpful to what Mueller is trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not helpful to the people who need to pursue this investigation and not to be challenged in any way. And I think what Comey is doing and waging basically a personal war, I can understand his anger. I mean, I went through a period of anger when I resigned from the CIA and testified against Robert Gates. But this is a former FBI director, a position that's been taken out of politics because of the long reign of J. Edgar Hoover,
right,
and given a 10-year longevity clause to try to remove it from the political arena, to make sure it isn't lined up with any presidential term in office, to give some independence to the FBI director. So for an FBI former director such as Comey to be making these personal attacks, I don't think is helpful right now. He should stick to the substance of what he has to offer. And now, I've ordered his book. It hasn't arrived yet.
Right.
I can't say
tomorrow.
I've read it, but I'm hopeful that Amazon will produce it tomorrow. They're pretty good in this kind of thing.
Right.
But that interview he gave to Stephanopoulos last night, and he's going to be on television, I think, just about every night this week, culminating with Rachel Maddow on Thursday. I don't know how far he's going to take this.
So just to complete this thought, John Dowd, who's no longer Trump's attorney, it's rumored that he dangled pardons for Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort. Does that not leave the president himself and the attorney open for obstruction charges?
I think so. I think it's going to be seen in the context of intent. You know, what was on Trump's mind when these lines or hints were put out there with regard to possible pardons. Then you add the Libby pardon. I'm sure that Donald Trump doesn't know Scooter Libby from Adam. I doubt if he's even familiar with the whole Ambassador Wilson, Valerie Plame affair in 2002, 2003.
And she lost her career over this.
Signal he wanted to send.
She lost her career over this incident, did she not?
Oh, certainly. She had to leave the CIA. In fact, I did a book event with her. She now lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she's written a few books herself. But she was one of those serious, dedicated public servants. She was undercover. In fact, she was working in the field of proliferation. And we didn't have a lot of assets working in that field who really understood the field of nuclear technology. So, to me, real harm was done to the national security interests of the United States. And this was exercised and orchestrated by the Vice President of the United States because of his anger about an op-ed that her husband had written. This was a very ugly period of time, but it was a time when you had a CIA director by the name of George Tenet who said it would be a slam dunk, and he said this to the president, to provide the kind of intelligence you need to convince the American people that we need to go to war. And you had his deputy, John McLaughlin, give the slam dunk briefing to the president, which was in January of 2003. And you had a CIA that wrote the phony national intelligence estimate in October of 2002. And then McLaughlin was the leader in an effort to write a speech for Colin Powell that was given in February 2003 that had one phony charge after another, 28 false allegations that were the rationale for going to war in March of 2003. And now John McLaughlin is a major spokesman on MSNBC News, which is supposed to be a left-of-center news organization, and we're supposed to have some faith in the credibility and accuracy of MSNBC reporting. Well, how can you when you allow people like John McLaughlin and others who are not just apologists for the CIA, but people who politicize intelligence at the CIA to be spokesmen in these positions?
Right.
That's something that needs to be examined.
If you've just joined us or tuned in, this is Heroes and Patriots. I'm Mary Massey, and we're talking with Melvin Goodman. He is a national security and intelligence expert. He worked as an analyst for the CIA and State Department. He has taught at the National War College and Johns Hopkins University and is currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. We have about 15 minutes or so, and I don't want to let the time get away from us. I'd like to talk about the two most recent Trump nominations or appointees. And the first one is GINA Haspel. You've already mentioned her as being known as, I think, the Bloody Queen. I don't remember what you said. Bloody Gina, thank you.
You could have said abominations.
What problems, let's back up a bit. We know that the CIA has utilized torture prior to 9/11, but certainly seems to have stepped that up. Could you just give us a sense of the history of the CIA's involvement in torture?
Well, the CIA's involvement in torture really began after 9/11. and George Tenet wanted some protection, some legal protection, and so Tenet was responsible for making sure that the Department of Justice wrote what we know now are the torture memoranda. These were produced primarily by John Yoo and Jay Bybee. Jay Bybee, by the way, was rewarded with a federal judgeship and sits on a federal court on the West Coast. John Yoo is on the faculty of the University of California at Berkeley, their law school. But the important thing to keep in mind is when the CIA conducted its torture and abuse at secret prisons, by the way, they went far beyond what even the Justice Department allowed for. Now, what the Justice Department allowed for was clearly torture and abuse. These were unconscionable memoranda that were written. We saw some of these in these items that were declassified. This looked like materials that mob lawyers would have written for mafia chieftain to excuse their behavior. These were clearly unconscionable documents. Then when you go and look at the torture and abuse program, you have leaders at the CIA who were not only cheerleaders for this activity, but carried out this activity and were very supportive of this activity. And the two names that come to mind are Jose Rodriguez, who was head of the operations directorate and head of the torture and abuse program for a large amount of time. And one of his chief deputies was GINA HASPEL, who earned the nickname Bloody GINA to a lot of people who knew her, because not only was she supportive of this activity, but she was the base commander of one of the worst secret prisons the United States and the CIA ran, the one in Thailand. They had secret prisons in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, in Afghanistan, but the one in Thailand was one of the worst.
And who would be in that prison? Who would be in Thailand in that prison?
Well, one of the people who was in Thailand was one of the person involved in the bombing of the USS Cole in the year 2000, Nishiri. Nishiri was waterboarded when she was the commander of that base. So she was involved in a hands-on way with torture and abuse. And then when Rodriguez, her boss, realized that these sadistic tapes that were made, there were about 92 torture tapes covering this sadistic activity, and he decided that he would have them destroyed.
Oh.
Now, I think I know what his thinking was. He thought there was greater risk in allowing these tapes to be seen than to destroy the tapes and deal with the consequences. As it turns out, the consequences amounted to nothing. And when he ordered that a cable be sent out to destroy these tapes, it was GINA HASPEL who he turned to and said, get a cable out to these secret prisons to destroy these tapes, particularly in Thailand. Now, one of the things that the CIA has always said, and I'm told that HASPEL is doing this now on the Hill, she's saying the tapes had to be destroyed to protect the identity of the people conducting the torture, because if Al-Qaeda or any terrorist organization could identify these people, there would be retaliation. Well, that's a lie. The people who conducted the torture were hooded. And throughout history, anyone who's conducted this kind of activity has never allowed himself to be identified.
And these would be U.S. These would be U.S. personnel, correct?
These would be U.S. CIA officials in some case. And remember, there were a lot of CIA people who would have nothing to do with this activity, which is why the CIA turned to two contractors from the United States Air Force to set up the program in the first place. And a lot of people who carried out this torture and abuse were contractors. And I'm not letting
they were or they were not. They were or they were not.
There were contractors.
There were contractors, okay.
In addition to CIA officials, because the CIA is guilty, no matter how you look at that. Because to me, what's shocking to me is that adults could sit around the room on the 7th floor in the office and conference room of the Director of Central Intelligence and discuss torture and abuse, including people like John Brennan, by the way, when he was on the executive staff. And not one individual that I'm aware of, we know no one resigned over this, but not one individual even said, we shouldn't be getting into this. We shouldn't be doing this. It's wrong. It's torture and abuse. And it's not a question of whether we could get good intelligence this way. It's that we shouldn't be doing it even if we got outstanding intelligence. The fact of the matter is We got nothing from this activity.
So the intelligence wasn't any better.
Senator Feinstein's
right.
report showed that's now been covered up, and all the copies have been called back by her successor at the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Richard Burr. So we'll never get the full story of what happened in these prisons, how many lies the CIA told to the White House about what they were doing and what they learned from this activity. And then, to make matters worse, the CIA allowed a series of former officers like John McLaughlin and others to write a book called Rebuttal to challenge the Senate report.
Ugh.
Well, in addition to the Senate report, the Office of the Inspector General at the CIA also wrote an outstanding report on torture and abuse. So we know there's material there that's authoritative material that's been covered up, but yet the CIA has been allowed to perpetuate this lie that what they did was legal and justified by the circumstances. This is quite unfortunate.
So Trump has appointed her. What do you think's going to happen? You think she'll make it through?
I have a feeling that she's going to run into not only resistance, but serious resistance, and she could have a problem getting through. Already, 2 Republicans, I believe, John McCain, if he's healthy enough to get to Washington, and I'm not sure that's the case, has made it clear that he's opposed to this appointment, and he's sort of an iconic figure. He's someone who was held in a Hanoi prison, or series of prisons, for 6.5 to 7 years, tortured on a regular basis, and knows how wrong this is.
Yeah.
Rand Paul has said he's going to vote no, and Susan Collins is on the fence. So if the Democrats hold firm, and the Democrats aren't very good at holding firm, the Democrats usually find ways of caving in or compromising when they shouldn't, so I can't be too optimistic about that. But there's a chance that she will not make it. She shouldn't make it. I don't think even presidents realize how much cynicism you create in an institution when you send someone like GINA HASPEL, who was in part responsible for torture and abuse, you send her back to the CIA as the director. This happened in '91 when George H.W. Bush nominated Robert Gates to be the CIA director, and he had a rough confirmation battle. But what the Senate did was to return the person to the CIA as director who was responsible for politicizing intelligence under William Casey in the 1980s. You create an incredible cynicism at an institution when you do that. It's wrong, and a Senate Intelligence Committee should understand that better than anyone.
In the last 7 or so minutes that we have, I'd like to also look at Mike Pompeo. We've already glanced at a little bit about his appointment. You have issues with him. Tell us what you know.
Well, I have a lot of issues with him. He was a Tea Party representative from Kansas. He's a hardliner. He was one of the worst Republican voices during the Benghazi debates. He wouldn't even accept the report of his own Republican Party, which went after Hillary Clinton. It wasn't good enough for him. When the matter of Edward Snowden came up, his answer was simple. He should receive the death penalty. Torture and abuse, reinstituted. I mean, this is a terrible hardliner who never should have been sent to an intelligence organization, because I don't think you can trust his objectivity or his sense of balance. And I wouldn't send him to the State Department, because there's nothing diplomatic about this man. This is a very bellicose figure, a very aggressive figure who talks up the importance of military force. He went to West Point. He served in the United States Army for 5 or 6 years before he went to Harvard Law School. He's the wrong individual. Now, I think he's clever enough to do certain things right. He acquitted himself fairly well at the hearings. I don't think he was as good as the mainstream media said he was. He dodged a lot of areas that they tried to press him on.
Such as what?
Very clever.
What did they press him on?
Evasive. Well, they pressed him on this issue of the investigation of the Trump White House and where he stood on the Mueller investigation, and whether he believed that what Mueller was doing was an attack on America. He dodged all of this. I mean, he's a very clever guy. This this is not a fool. Trump has appointed a lot of people to cabinet positions who I think are utter fools. A DeVos at education knows nothing about education. A Carson at HUD knows nothing about the field of urban renewal. Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, knows nothing about the energy department. But people like Pruitt at EPA, very dangerous, and people like Pompeo, very smart, very clever, I think very dangerous. He won't be that moderate adult in the room that we were told Tillerson was in trying to talk Trump back from certain things. If anything, I see Pompeo egging Trump on. Remember, Tillerson was urging talks with North Korea. He was urging diplomacy, and whenever he talked about diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, it was Trump who said, "You're wasting your time, Rex." Well, it turns out that Trump was moving in that direction. We didn't know it at the time until he surprised us with the announcement that there was going to be a summit meeting.
Yeah, next month.
With the North Korean leader. But we were counting on Tillerson for being a kind of a moderate player, along with Mattis. Some people felt McMaster should have been in that role too. I frankly don't think he was. He was an improvement on Flynn, but now we got the worst possible case. We've got John Bolton.
You mentioned him.
A more irresponsible actor in a war cabinet than someone like John Bolton.
Wow. You think Pompeo will be confirmed?
I think there's going to be resistance, but I think ultimately he'll be confirmed. He comes out of the Congress. They usually are generous with their own. He was clever, as I said earlier, about calling Clinton and Kerry and seemed to be going through the paces. He visited all the Senate offices where he thought there was opposition. He made it clear he was going to staff up the department. He made it clear he was going to rebuild the budget, and he was going not to accept the cuts that Donald Trump was talking about. So I think he's been clever enough to win enough support, but I do think it's unfortunate. When you look at that position, that's the first cabinet position in the line of succession to the presidency, if it should ever get that far. When you think of the people who served as secretaries of state, when you think of people like John Quincy Adams and Charles Evans Hughes and Dean Acheson, Henry Kissinger for that matter, and then you think of someone like Mike Pompeo, I think this is just ludicrous.
Wow.
But that's what's happened to the government. There's been a tremendous dumbing down of the government under this administration, and a lot of damage is being done to U.S. national interest. We see a decline in U.S. influence across the board in the global community, and it's going to be very hard to rebuild these institutions. It's not going to be an easy task at all.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Mel, for spending the last hour talking about these difficult topics and unfortunate topics. And I hope your book is going well, Whistleblower at the CIA, and that you will join us again as things develop. It looks like we're in for a ride.
I think we're in for a long ride, and I've got a book coming out later this year, 2019, American Carnage, The Wars of Donald Trump, and I think maybe we can talk again.
Oh, wow, super, yes, I'm going to hold you to it. Thank you so much.
I'm going to hold you to it.
Well, it's a deal.
Thanks a lot, Mary.
All right, bye now. So I've been speaking with Melvin A. Goodman. He is a national security and intelligence expert. He was a former analyst at the CIA and the State Department. He has taught at the National War College, which sometime I'd like to just talk with someone about that, and Johns Hopkins University. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and you can go online and look up that institution. They do some great work. That's my show for today. I'm Mary Massey. This has been Heroes and Patriots. We are a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Archives of the program, Heroes and Patriots, can be found on both Facebook and YouTube by searching Heroes and Patriots. KMEC Radio, Mendocino Environmental Center. Our thanks to ELLIOTT HERSKOWITZ-HALE and Kevin KAFAYI for the prep that they did on today's show. A quick run through of our underwriters. We thank the members of the Mendocino Environmental Center, and underwriting by Dr. Richard Phillips, Dunlap Roofing, Fry Vineyards and Winery, and or Hot Springs. I'd like to close with a quote from Judge Greg from 1999, and this was in today's full-page article on the opinion page, the president is not above the law. And as a sidebar, they have, quote, in a country based on the system of laws, which is really the great gift given to us under the terms of our Constitution, there needs to be a consistency of application. The idea that all people are equal under the law is not a relative term. Thanks for tuning in.